Well, the rise in US inflation is also a warning to Australia. The headline rate in the United States overnight of 8.3% is slightly lower than it was, but its persistence above 8% has clearly spooked the markets, as we've explained to you. A quick look at some of the biggest movers shows an uncanny similarity to the things rising fastest in price here in Australia. Petrol up 43%, energy, that's gas for households, up 30%, used cars 22%, electricity 11%, food 9.4%. So let's bring in here Adam Creighton, Washington correspondent for the Australian newspaper and a contributor here on Sky News. I spoke with him earlier about those big jumps.
Yeah, certainly, Ross. Everyone tends to focus on that annual figure. You're quite right. There was a small fall from 8.5 to 8.3. But the more important figure, and certainly the figure that the markets look at, is the monthly figure. And that was pretty worrying. And you've got to say, I mean, if you strip out the volatile items, the food and the energy, the core inflation, if you like, over the month actually doubled from 0.3% to 0.6%. And I think that explains why we saw the big sell-off this week in the markets, because I think investors realised that the Fed saw that number too, and that means, as you suggested, that the inflationary pressure in the economy is still very high. Also, if you look at the services part of the economy, which for months we've seen fairly subdued price growth, that actually accelerated quite a bit, and it's running at the highest level now since 1990.
So that's something quite different. When you start to get inflation in services, that's quite a different thing for an economy, because that says something quite different about the future as well.
Yeah, look, it certainly is. I think economists, certainly central banks, have been trying to blame external factors. Governments have been blaming external factors for this inflation. The war in Russia, the lockdowns in China, the COVID pandemic restrictions. But when you start seeing so much inflation in the service sector, which are not related to global trade or supply bottlenecks, it's got nothing to do with it. I mean, the rent on a house, rent on an apartment, that has absolutely nothing to do with those factors I just mentioned. But those prices are now rising at the fastest pace in 20, 25 years. And that suggests that this is a monetary phenomenon, which means that there's excess money in the economy. And of course, the fault for that is our own governments and central banks. But of course, they don't like talking about that.
OK, so then bring it back to Australia, because the parallels with what's happening in the United States, though Australia might be 6 months behind, are very similar. In other words, fuel prices, petrol prices, 43% over the past year. Energy prices, which is household gas, up 30%. Used cars up 22%. Same story here. Electricity up 11%. But the big one that got me, airline prices rose 18% in the past month in America. And with the demand for airline air seats here, you can see exactly the same phenomenon happening.
Yeah, no, look, certainly I was, just on a personal note, I was going to book a flight yesterday to Chicago return, and it was $380. So that's extremely expensive for a domestic flight, which is, roughly the same distance as Sydney to Melbourne. But just on the Australian situation, yeah, that's certainly right. I think Australia is going to mirror what has been happening in the US, just with a 3 to 6 month delay. The hard thing, of course, for the RBA is that they only get the reading every 3 months and not every month like everywhere else in the world.
OK, so then let's get to one topical issue this week in Australia, and that is Anthony Albanese says wages should go up by 5.1% to match inflation, and says, well, look, on the minimum wage, it's only $1 an hour. What does that really matter? But in actual fact, it creates inflation and puts more pressure on the Reserve Bank. I think somehow that Anthony Albanese is missing the point about the impact of rising wages, even if it is the minimum wage.
Well, look, I think the first point there is that it's not the government's role, especially not the federal government, to be setting wages in Australia. And there's a very sorry history of that, of ripple effects of when one industry gets a pay rise, then all the industries get a pay rise. And as you suggest, that increases demand, and then that in turn lifts inflation. So I really think that's an unfortunate policy, and it's not going to help workers in the long run. The best thing I've always maintained for governments to do is if they want to increase wages, is to lower taxes on workers, because that's a direct mechanism that they do control, and that does obviously free up disposable income for workers. But as for the 5.1% increase, I think it's a very bad sign.
OK, so then let's get back to where we were a moment ago, and that was about the excess cash sloshing around our economies in the United States, here in Australia as well. How is it that central banks or government take that money out of the economy without killing the economy stone dead? After all, they are talking recession in the United States as an increasing risk.
Well, certainly most central banks around the world, in the US, Europe and Australia, I believe, they've stopped, if you like, creating money to prop up their government's budget deficits. They've stopped that and they've started to lift interest rates, but only very, very slightly. And the concern there is, of course, that even with these slight increases, we've already seen these fairly dramatic responses in financial markets, which of course raises the question, can they raise interest rates as much as they really need to do to slow the economy down? And will that in turn cause a recession? It's interesting, in the US, we've seen the probability of a recession in the next 12 months. That's increased from about 20% to about 33% based on various financial market prices just in recent weeks. So the risk there of a recession is certainly increasing. And as you know, if the US catches cold, then the rest of the world will as well.
Adam Creighton in Washington, as always, many thanks for your time.